And we back. We back. Baltimore Flava Radio live on RadioOnFire.com. Live on it.
Baltimore Sun wants to hear Jen do something.
Oh, he wanted some buzz.
Boy, does golf work?
No better time than the present.
Well, she didn't have any alcoholic beverages, or as they say, adult beverages.
Look,
on the next project.
All I need is 4 shots, and I'm in there. I'm trying to tell y'all.
When we were off air, it was just 1 shot. Now she needs 4.
I said 1 to 4. It depends on how strong that one. If it's a double, whatever.
Lord have mercy. Let's get into this interview because this about to go some places it don't need to go.
All right,
man. Oh man. An honor. Finally get this dude up here. Roberto Alejandro. Just call you a blogger, like a
journalist.
Yeah, because and you've been around doing your thing for a minute, and I just came across you at I think we were at Picasso's for one of the In the Pocket events, and Last Born, my man, introduced you. Tell us a little bit about first your website.
Yeah, so I mean the website's called onbackground.com. It's a hip hop and policy website focused on issues of poverty. And so, we do a lot of different types of coverage, but some of the more important work we do is talking directly to people who are making a living in the streets, whether selling drugs or trying to panhandle or squeegee windshields at an intersection, and let them sort of describe the social conditions that inform their lives, their decisions, their reality in their own words. After everything that happened in Baltimore with Freddie Gray and the demonstrations, one of the questions that in media we were asking ourselves a lot was, how did we not see this coming? And now not all media equally didn't see what happened in those weeks coming, but there was a question of why have these communities not been heard from for so long? And it was hard not to think about the way we traditionally do journalism and not conclude that we haven't heard from them because we don't talk to them. I mean, it's very simple. We don't talk to poor people in places like Baltimore, in places like Sandtown, Winchester, in places like McKeldrey Park. And the simple truth is probably most journalists are just as afraid of those neighborhoods as your average Trump supporter, right? And so, it's not good when we'll only show up in a neighborhood in a city that we claim to cover if the police get there first. Right? That's not okay. And we don't get to sort of say we're part of the solution or part of the sort of protectors of our democratic discourse when we ourselves exclude so many people from that conversation.
Now, tell me how this process works, man, because I can see you down on Lexington Market or somewhere and just kind of walking up. But I mean, if those are the type of people that you look for, you really got to go, deep into the trenches sometimes.
No, absolutely. I mean, I spend a lot of time just going to neighborhoods that I think a lot of other people
You go by
avoid.
yourself?
Yeah.
My man.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, one, when you're in those places, you realize how much of that fear is just, people's perceptions about what happens there. And I'm not particularly dark skinned, but I'm Puerto Rican, of Puerto Rican descent. And I know what it is to be, defined from without, to be defined completely with complete lack of regard to anything I've ever done or said or thought. And so for me to turn around and do that here, because I'm not from here, because I don't look like I'm from certain neighborhoods here, would be really the greatest act of hypocrisy that I could probably engage in. And so, and it's funny because Baltimore is a place that's pretty warm and friendly, so it's not a hard place to strike up conversations. And especially with certain actors in our street economies, they engage me before I engage them. And so, hey, you just opened the door to a conversation. Let me ask you a few questions. And I think we need to do more about that, especially because, as journalists, we cover a lot of policy issues. And as journalists in a place like Baltimore, we cover a lot of policy issues related to poverty specifically. But because so few of us actually touch impoverished realities, we're really poor adjudicators of whether or not any given policy has even the remotest chance of working, whether any given policy even slightly touches what the reality looks like on the ground. And, you know, one of the examples I tend to give is our Youth Works program in the city, right? Which is designed to fund part-time summer jobs for youth, which there's nothing wrong with that. But when I speak to guys who are selling drugs, I hear this story a lot. I was 9, 10, 11. My parent was addicted to drugs. I wasn't being taken care of. My siblings weren't being taken care of. So here I am on this corner, right? A kid who needs to pay bills at 9, 10, 11, or make sure he and his siblings are being fed, right? And the entire premise, the sort of, you know, learn the value of a buck by having a part-time summer job. I mean, that's great in a sort of upper middle class context, like the one I grew up in, where teenagers work only because they need, like, you know, money to impress their little girlfriends or whatever. But in a place like Baltimore, where you might be the head of your household before you're even in your teens, that's not an acceptable or smart policy if we're talking about addressing those kids on the corner, right? You don't want them on a corner. Well, then you better reach them before they hit 14 and can get a work permit. Yeah. Because the reality is most of these kids are entering those economies at ages far younger than we even realize. By
14, they're carrying guns, and
yeah, I mean, by then it's
way too late in a lot of cases.
Too late, and in way too many cases, right? And we've seen after this Department of Justice report how we've been trying to address the problems that arise in any poor context by essentially brutalizing communities, hopefully into submission, and it hasn't worked. It's not the sort of thing that could have ever worked. And it's at this point just become an end in itself, it feels like, for our police department. We just brutalize because we brutalize, right? At some point, brutality is not so different than torture. The aim of torture is never to get information. The end of torture is torture. That's it. That's the only reason you do it. And it feels like increasingly that's what our police department has become. But for us as journalists to do an effective job of covering these issues, we need to be able to call BS when someone suggests to us that a policy targeting 14, 15, and 16-year-olds is going to have an impact on public safety, right? No, not in this city, not in the conditions that these kids are having to navigate.
Because you like really go down into the heart of the city to cover a lot of your stuff, like outside of like the Freddie Gray stuff and the stuff that really makes it big on the news, like what's been that one interview that you've done that's like really grabbed you and made you like really just go, wow? That's really kind of like tugged at your heartstrings, like, you know what I mean?
All of them. I mean, it's hard to pick one, to be honest. I mean, this is the nature of the work I'm doing. I'm kind of depressed all the time because they all tug at my heartstrings. And even, you know, even before I started doing this project, when I was still writing for the Afro, you know, I remember interviewing a neighbor of mine who was trying to get the rats addressed in the alley near his house. You know, this person lives like half a block away, a block or so at the time. And, you know, I hadn't known him particularly long. We just met, and, you know, he'd mentioned this problem, and I said I'd do a story on it. And I went to his house and I saw, like, the walls were bare, right? There was barely any furniture. There was like a stand with a TV and like a couple of chairs. One of them was like a folding chair, right? Like there was nothing in the house. And it was one of those like early moments in my time in Baltimore, because I started writing for the Afro shortly after I moved here, where I started to realize what that word poverty really meant. You know, like I have a pretty extensive educational background, and for pretty much most of my adult life, I've been on the sort of left end of the academic spectrum. And there was nothing in all that education and training that really prepared me for what poverty looked like. Like, there's nothing here. There's nothing in this house. Like, kids are being raised here. And I'm here to talk about like a rat issue in the alley. And, you know, that's sort of an example of an early experience where for someone who didn't grow up seeing the type of poverty that exists here in Baltimore, where it was starting to hit home, you know. And then when people are telling you stories about, you know, having to be the head of the household at 9 or 11. When people talk about trying to get help but not being able to because of their criminal record. You know, if anyone goes to the website On Background, at the top, you know, there's different links, and one of them is snapshots. And you can listen to any one of those snapshots and sort of understand why I do the work that I do. Because the conditions that people are navigating here are frankly inhumane. They shouldn't exist anywhere. And the fact that they exist in an American city, 45 minutes away from the American capital, is frankly a crime. I don't know how else to describe it. And we really need to be paying attention. And if we're serious about hearing the poor, then we actually have to go speak to them and let them speak on their own terms. And so, as part of that work, people have their colorful vocabularies here as in any other place. And I don't censor them. I say, say it exactly how you want, because people need to hear your truth. They need to hear your ideas in the way that you would want to express them. Because, I think one of the problems in media is that we try to clean everything up, and we deprive the things that are being said of the full meaning and emotional weight.
The emotion, exactly.
And so, for me, that's a methodological failure. And frankly, it's not the job of the media to police the public morality. If someone wants to curse when they're explaining why they're on a corner, they should be able to curse, because that's not the easiest life to live. And the idea that we'll only speak to them when they say it in vocabularies that sort of are okay with us, that in and of itself is, I think, a betrayal of one's duty as a journalist.
All right, so let's backtrack a little bit. You said that you worked for the Afro, and I actually didn't know that you weren't from here. So where are you from? How did you end up in Baltimore? And how in the world did a Puerto Rican start writing for the Afro-American, man?
Yeah, so I was born in Puerto Rico. Okay. My family moved to the U.S. when I was 2. My father was a student leader in Puerto Rico, involved in socialist student movements, and he was part of a couple of major demonstrations that shut down the university when he was a student. This led to imprisonment, secret police surveillance, and eventually he was in law school. He was studying law at the time, and he got blacklisted. He got thrown out of his university and then blacklisted everywhere else. Wow. And so, he got the opportunity to pursue a doctorate here in the States, and so we moved as a result of that. And once he started teaching, he got a job in Amherst, Massachusetts, at the University of Massachusetts. And so I grew up there. I went to college there. I had the privilege of actually studying, taking a couple classes with my father while I was there. And then I kind of hopped around, just trying to sort of find my way. I lived in Connecticut. I lived in New York. I lived in England.
I knew there had to be a little New York in there.
Puerto Rican in the Northeast. I was going to end up there eventually. I lived in England for a little bit, and then I came to DC, and then I was in New York again. And I moved to Baltimore because my fiance at the time was in DC, and we were trying to find sort of an affordable place to live. I was in Brooklyn, and DC wasn't really working out, and she was still studying at a school in DC, so we couldn't be too far. And so I had a friend here, and I ended up here on the basis of his recommendation. And I'd been out of work for like 8 months when I moved to Baltimore, and I just left a resume anywhere where some skill of mine had some relevance to what they did. And the Afro was just the first place to call. And, when I left my resume there, I was just thinking, they might need some help copy editing from time to time. It won't be like, it might be $50 here and there, something like that, but just until I land on my feet. But I get this email like, do you still want to be a writer? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Why not? And it just kind of went from there. But, I think with time, I spent about 2 years pretty immersed in the Black media landscape here in Baltimore, in sort of the established Black media landscape, Afro, WEAA. And what I found personally over the course of those 2 years was that the sort of commitment to poor communities of color at those institutions wasn't particularly strong. Certainly they tell more of those stories than a lot of our white news outlets, but that has more to do with the sort of niche it's carved out in terms of its place in the overall journalism market here in Baltimore than it does necessarily with a hard commitment to making sure that the issues in these communities are being addressed by those in a position to address them. And which is why I ultimately decided that I need to sort of focus on my own project.
Okay. And was there anything else between when you were at the Afro and the time that you decided to start doing On Background?
Yeah.
Anything journalistic, like if you were working at McDonald's or something, we don't. Yeah.
No, I mean,
or if you were selling drugs.
No, I mean, I spent some time doing a lot of guest stuff at WEAA. I've been on Democracy Now! Because of some of my reporting and things of this nature. But otherwise, mostly just writing. I've done a little writing for The Brew as well. But mostly, I spent my time focused writing for the Afro during that time.
What would be like your ultimate Baltimore story to write about?
That to write about, or something that I've experienced here?
Either or.
Ooh,
both.
The ultimate Baltimore story. I don't know what the ultimate one would be. I've been here about 2.5 years. I don't know if that's long enough to make that definitive a statement. The biggest story I broke while at the Afro was the sex for repairs scandal at Gilmore Homes. And that's a good example of a story where, we don't talk to poor women in the projects. So that sort of thing doesn't normally get reported. This is the sort of thing that when the story came out, people were like, that's been happening since the 70s. Really? How has this been happening since the 70s? And we're not talking about this all the time, right? I mean, we're talking about a rape scandal. That's what it is. When you coerce sex for anything, it's rape. So I would say that's kind of one of those big stories that also sort of speaks to why I do what I do with On Background, because those aren't voices we normally hear. And I think the tendency for journalists, when you hear about a story like that, coming from poor women in a place like Gilmore Homes, the tendency around here is to say, they're just saying that for money. Right. They're just trying to get money, right? Exactly. Even when the Baltimore Sun, back in, I want to say that was like 2014, broke the story about how much money the police or the city had been paying out in settlements over police brutality, right? Which was a huge story, but the conversation we had in Baltimore was like, how come we're not challenging these people in court so we don't have to pay the money? Well, now with the DOJ report, we know why, because they're not making these things up. Our police is brutal to our Black citizens and frankly, to all our citizens. And so, but the way the sort of upper middle class milieu in which most journalists subsist, they just can't understand what's going on in these neighborhoods, and they don't believe it at all. And I think that's why with On Background, that idea of a hip hop methodology of journalism, what would journalism look like if it was informed by the same need to give a voice to the voiceless, if it was informed by the same energy that took a turntable and turned it into an instrument? What would it look like if those perspectives were informing everything that it did, informing which things they demanded be verified by vigorous investigation and fact-checking, and which things were prepared to accept as just an established truth? That looks different, right, from a hip-hop perspective than it does from your traditional journalistic norm. And so, hip-hop is really key in that sense to the project that I'm doing, because the things I started encountering here in Baltimore 2.5 years ago were the things Naughty by Nature was talking about. Everything's gonna be all right. That was like one of my first favorite hip hop songs. And I was just watching the video the other day and I was like, oh man, I've been there. I've been to this place. It's here, here in Gilmore, here in McKeldrey Park, here in Douglas Homes.
Well, let's take a quick break real quick, because I do actually want to talk about the work that you're doing in covering the hip hop scene in Baltimore. You're very deep in the hip hop scene, so we're actually about to get a little lesson from you right now, because I'm sure you're more versed in it than I am. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back with more Roberto